Hello everyone and happy May. I think celebrating is always more fun in video format, and so I'm making this impromptu video today to celebrate a couple of exciting pieces of news with you all. The first is that the Patreon community that you all are a part of, or perhaps you're visiting today, has hit an important milestone, and I wanted to share that and some thoughts about what it might mean for crowdfunding research in general. The second is that I'm open sourcing Orbit today, and there's some interesting discussion to be had about kind of funding models research and that decision as well. And the third is that I now have a modest budget which I'm hoping to use to involve some more people in my work. First, this funding milestone. Now, if you are a new tenure-track professor at an American research university, one of the main early career grants that you would be seeking is this grant that the NSF provides called the CAREER grant. Now, it's not a sure thing. Funding rates are about 15 to 25% of applicants, but it's meant to support early career researchers for about 5 years at a relatively modest rate. They may need to supplement it with some other funding, but enough that they can kind of get their research going in a meaningful way. If you're at a kind of a top-tier research university, you'll see pretty much all of the faculty in the sciences having one of these grants. And so, while it's a relatively modest grant, it is our existing institution's most common entry-level grant for new investigators, and so it's an interesting thing to compare against when talking about alternative funding models. So the exciting milestone for this community is that we're now crowdfunding at a level about 2/3 of one of these NSF career grants, which is really meaningful that we're starting to come up on substituting for this existing institution's job in a real way. But of course there are some important differences between these grants in crowdfunding land and the NSF provided career grant. And I thought it would be interesting to talk about those differences. Now, one of the most important differences is really a weakness in what I've been doing so far. Now, these career grants for new investigators, they are meant to include a really substantial section about your research plan, but also a really substantial education plan, and a plan for how you are going to integrate education into your research. And that could mean a variety of things. It could mean mentoring postdoctoral scholars. It could just mean undergraduate education. But ideally, what these grants are trying to support is a synergy between research and developing new knowledge on the one hand, and education and supporting the future generations of knowledge creators on the other hand. And part of the point of the grant is to subsidize those future researchers that you're going to be training. So I don't have really any of that as part of my work right now, other than, I don't know, the lightweight community engagement that I do on Twitter. And it's really interesting to me to think about what it would mean to try to ramp up that component. One of the things that concerns me is that it's difficult to engage in education in a field which has such poorly defined methodology and practice. And so it's not like there's a textbook or a curriculum that I could refer people to, or really like a strong pre-existing tradition. Obviously there's a lot of prior art in human-computer interaction and in cognitive science for the kind of work that I do, but this kind of like inventing novel cognitive augmenting interfaces thing, we haven't really figured out a great theory or framework for how to do that. So I've been wary to engage in any kind of large-scale education activities, but I do want to try to ramp that up over the coming years. So I'm investing a fair amount of effort into try to capture what it is that I'm doing as I'm doing it, and hoping to synthesize that into something that I might actually be able to use both to mentor other people who might want to research with me, and also maybe to publish something which might help people getting into the space. But this is a spot where I would not qualify for one of these grants with what I'm doing. Now you can also see this as an advantage. You could say like, well, these education components in new fields are something that's kind of just slow down the researcher. And so I have more of the position of a research scientist where I just get to focus on that and I don't really have to worry about teaching and service. Goods and bads associated with that. And of course, hiding in all of this is the fact that graduate students and postdoctoral faculty or postdoctoral scholars are sort of a source of labor. And I mean that not in the code implementing way, although we'll talk about that a little later, but in the sense that there are avenues that I'd like to explore that I just don't have the capacity to explore right now. And it would be nice to have other people doing that with me. But I also feel there's a moral challenge to taking on students for me in this field. And that's that if I were a professor at a university in an established field, and you come to me as a graduate student, then there's this implicit deal that you work with me for a few years, and after a few years, you are going to step out as an independent investigator of your own and establish your own agenda, and you are hopefully going to be able to do that by, say, getting a faculty slot at some other university. It's a pipeline. And of course, you're not guaranteed a faculty slot. In fact, there's far too many graduate students for faculty slots, but that's kind of the understanding, that you're taking on this kind of apprentice position, and in doing that, you're rolling the dice and saying, like, I'm competing for one of these faculty slots that are available at various institutions, and funding slots for those positions, which are provided by grant makers. Now, the moral issue is that pipeline, that path, those institutions and those funding sources don't really exist in this space. And so if I'm taking on someone who's excited about doing independent research of their own, they can work with me for a while, and that might be helpful to both of us, and maybe push my ideas forward and maybe help them develop their own practice. But there's really no end state where they kind of get a shot at doing it on their own. They'd have to create that for themselves. And arguably they'd be put in a pretty bad position to create it by kind of working with me as an apprentice for a few years, because they're not going to be amassing capital that they could use to support themselves. Maybe they could be developing relationships with funders or with an audience or with grant makers, but they're kind of going to have to figure that stuff out on their own. Basically, this lack of like a next step for a student is a problem. It's both like a practical problem, but also like a moral problem. Like I feel bad taking someone on in this way when there's not clearly a place for them to go next. So that's one key difference between these funding sources. Another interesting difference between an NSF CAREER grant and the Patreon crowdfunding model is that the latter is this highly continuous incremental process. So if I'm applying for a career grant, it's kind of like a big bang process. I'm going to spend 100 plus hours on the application for that. I'm going to submit this thing, and there will be a long process which, as many as 6 months later, will maybe give me a decision. But that decision, if it's positive, will support me for 5 years. And so for 5 years, I basically just don't really have to worry about at least that source of funding. I guess I have to be worried about my next grant, maybe a year or two before the 5 years is ended. But it's this very discrete funding model. And the Patreon model, on the other hand, has this really interesting property that it's continuous and incremental and ongoing. This is both good and bad. So the good part is that you don't need this really well thought through research plan in order to get started and get some funding. To get an NSF CAREER grant, you're supposed to have a pretty clear picture of how you're going to carry out this research and what you hope to achieve with it, which arguably limits the types of research you can do, or requires that you've already done a bunch of the work up front. And in fact, it's pretty common for junior faculty to apply for this NSF CAREER grant in their second or their third year of being faculty because of that. So it's kind of a shame that the discrete nature of the NSF CAREER grant seems to discourage it's not meant for funding highly exploratory, speculative research that the investigator can't articulate very clearly, or where there's going to be a lot of bricolage involved, perhaps. This incremental continuous funding is also an opportunity for people who don't yet have much standing, or even potentially much skill, to incrementally build up their funding source. And so something I'm excited about is the idea that maybe you have a day job, but in your nights and weekends you start exploring some projects that you find interesting, and maybe you can build up a small crowdfunding community around that, and start earning enough money from that to make you feel like those nights and weekends are really well invested, and so you kind of double down on it, and maybe eventually you get to this point where you can leave your day job. Now obviously there's a big jump there, but I think that's an exciting property of the crowdfunding versus the grant model. Another interesting thing about the continuous or incremental nature of the crowdfunding model is that it doesn't expire per se. The NSF CAREER grant is for 5 years, and it's granted to about 300 researchers per year. But the Patreon funding is potentially indefinite, so long as you keep doing work that people want to support. And that's both good and bad. It's good in that you don't have to completely change up your funding model and have this kind of all or nothing switch in year 4 or whatever of your work. But it's bad insofar as there's this feeling maybe that you've got to keep producing, or maybe it's not as stable or secure feeling as having all of these funds in a in kind of a guaranteed way, as in the CAREER grant. So the last difference that I wanted to discuss between the NSF CAREER grant and the crowdfunding approach for research is this question of who gets to decide what to fund. And it's really different answers in the two spaces. So for an NSF CAREER grant, and the most important part of the decision process is there's what's called a merit review, wherein your proposed research is reviewed by about 3 peers or informed experts in the space that you propose to investigate, and they will issue written comments and scores and have some discussions with them, kind of coordinating officers who will then decide what to fund. So it's a relatively small number of high expertise people, and that has advantages and disadvantages. So you don't have to convince that many people on the one hand, but there's also a lot of problems with peer review. Perhaps these are people who are established in your field and you're kind of trying to take your field in a weird direction, or maybe there isn't really a field around the work you're doing. And so there's some concern that peer review tends to perpetuate stasis or more conservative ideas, things like that. And I think that's probably at least partially true. Certainly in my adjacent field, human-computer interaction, peer review seems to promote a set of fairly conservative values and processes that would really impede my work, I think. So the crowdfunding model, on the other hand, you have lay people or interested fans deciding that work is interesting, and you have to persuade hundreds of them instead of just a couple. So that seems harder, but you don't have to persuade them very hard. So the merit review is kind of a high stakes thing. I think these reviewers feel like they're setting standards for this very important institutional body, and so they're going to be kind of defensive about what qualifies and what's worthy. But a patron deciding to toss you $5, even $5 a month, is it's just not that high stakes a decision by comparison. And so while you have to convince a lot more people, you maybe don't have to convince them very hard. And that's interesting. It's also interesting that they are much less likely to be, say, experts or peers or something like that. Now, obviously, I do have a lot of funders who are experts and peers, and I'm grateful for you. But a lot of them are just, random internet people who find the work interesting, which is great. So this is good and bad. It means if you have this work that doesn't really like fit in, but other weirdos who maybe aren't high status or high power think it's interesting, then you can maybe cobble together some funding through crowdsourcing. That might be difficult to achieve through traditional channels. But a challenging part of this is, like, to what extent can the crowd actually evaluate research? In my case, I worry that if I were investigating something that was like equally important, but like less obviously legible to casual observers, that I would have a lot more trouble getting funded. And that's a real concern. I worry that this general effect might make crowdfunded research more boring, or maybe like more driven by fashion or mass market appeal. But anyway, long story short, I'm really excited that this crowdfunding community has managed to go much of the way to matching our main government funding for new faculty in the sciences. I mean, that's really, really remarkable. And I definitely would not have expected that crowdfunded research could do that 2 years ago. Hopefully it's something which can generalize to more than just me. So all this leads us to the second topic I wanted to talk about, which is that I'm open sourcing Orbit, which is the platform I've been developing for the mnemonic medium, programmable attention in general, and I'm doing that because we have reached this funding milestone. So the path that I've been on is one where when I did not feel safe in my source of financial support, I felt like I had to kind of leave my options open. Like, I've spent, a year working on the software, like, oh geez, am I gonna have to like commercialize this? Am I gonna have to raise VC money around this? These are not things that I wanted to do, but I felt unsafe. And so I felt like I had to leave that option open, and that's why I had not open sourced Orbit up until this point. But now I feel sufficiently safe that I am past that point. But it's probably important to discuss like why open source this kind of thing. Something like Orbit, which is about knowledge management, about your mind, I think it really wants to be open source. There's a practical perspective on this, which is that the whole conceit is you're trying to kind of bring in these micro tasks, these pieces of knowledge from all kinds of different places. And so that kind of, that feels, if not open source, like it wants to be open formats, open protocol, things like this. And then also, just ideologically, it's very intimate. And I think in terms of trust, I don't like to spend a lot of time putting my mind into a system that could potentially just be taken away someday, that has like the smell of lock-in, that feels like it's some weird format that I'm never going to be able to parse. So I'm hoping that open sourcing it will be able to create some trust. And also, hopefully, it'll engender some interesting like mashups and experimentation. Also, just stepping back, I view my role as provisioning public goods. That's kind of what I'm trying to do here. And open source software is, I think, generally in software land, a better public good than closed source software. Now, there are types of software that I think really do benefit from being commercialized. In fact, like the public benefits from those pieces of software being commercialized. Like Stripe, for instance, is an important piece of infrastructure. You could even argue it's like a public good, but it needs like a huge number of people maintaining it and all these operational people, and there's like partnerships and stuff, and like all of that needs like a lot of resources to keep it running. Something small like this, I'm hopeful, though these words may bite me, that I can keep this service running with relatively little effort. I feel very anxious even just saying that, so we'll see. It is possible that long-term like the Orbit data formats and the application and things like that, and even the server if you want to self-host, like all of them are open source, but maybe running the service is so taxing eventually that some fee is necessary in order to make sure I can hire someone to be on PagerDuty or whatever. I'm not really thinking about that right now. But it does come into play in the licensing model that I chose, which is kind of interesting. I haven't seen many projects do this, though a number have done things kind of like this. So what I'm doing licensing-wise is that all of the libraries are licensed under the permissive Apache license, and then the main application and the main backend server are dual licensed under AGPL, which is a strong copyleft license, and it's viral over the network, as well as the business software license, which is a relatively new software license that allows you to do whatever you want for non-production purposes, and after some number of years, 3 years in Orbit's case, it turns into the permissively licensed Apache software. And this licensing scheme is meant to deter kind of cheap copycat commercializations. Khan Academy had this problem where when it was open sourced, there were a bunch of people who like downloaded the app, changed the name, put it on the App Store, like charged $10, and like Khan Academy would get these angry letters and stuff. It's really bad. And if they're using your name, you can yell at them for trademark purposes, but sometimes they'd actually do it in a way that was totally compliant, and it just felt really bad. So I don't want that. But then also, if I do end up needing to someday charge for the service model, I'd like to reserve some asymmetric power to capture some of that value as basically, I guess, payment for my upfront development cost. But like I said, that's not something that I am thinking about now. It's also not something that I want to do. Like, I'm not interested in commercializing this. It sounds boring, basically. Along with the open source, there are some interesting dangers. I have run or been a large part of 2 large open source projects before. Both of them, it was a very taxing experience, and I do not seek to repeat that experience. In recent years, platforms like GitHub have kind of redefined what people's norms for open source is to be like a project which is community run, and the community kind of decides on the roadmap, and everybody submits issues, and anybody can propose features and so on. And that's like fine and good for a lot of projects. It would tax me beyond my abilities for Orbit. So we're gonna have something not that. We'll have to together kind of articulate what it will be. But I mean, essentially the idea is that at least for the near future, this thing is primarily a vehicle for this research that I'm doing, and perhaps that collaborators will be doing with me. And so I'm going to try to be minimizing kind of extensive open source community interactions that are not in direct service of those research goals. Probably that will open up over time. There's more information in the repository. You can read about this. So that's a lot of cynicism or negativity. I do believe in and have experienced the positive side of open source, wherein generous contributors have delivered a lot of value both to me and to the community by coming in and implementing a feature that needed to get done but I didn't want to do, or identifying some horrible bug that no one knew existed that I really cared about. So I look forward to those kinds of contributions, and I am excited to be open sourcing the project. In the coming weeks and months, I will probably launch some kind of, maybe it'll be a mailing list for people who are interested in participating in or following along with development decisions, roadmaps, things like this. It's too early for like a users list. Most of the things that people tell me that they want or that are bad or whatever, like I know they bother me a lot too. So I'm mostly not looking for that kind of engagement right now. Okay, the final thing that I wanted to talk about is experimenting with kind of expanding the set of people working on these tools. So as we start approaching the funding level of an NSF Career grant, my expenses are increasingly taken care of, and maybe I can even save a little bit for a rainy day, which is nice and makes me less nervous. And that means that at this point, or relatively soon, marginal funds start being not for my pocket or for my mortgage, but rather for getting poured back into the project, which will almost invariably take the form of paying other people for their time working on it. Ideally, I'd love to be able to fund both technical staff who can really help me out by implementing important pieces of infrastructure and improving on my very rapidly written research quality code, as well as research staff who can meaningfully investigate some of the open questions and design challenges that seem to bear. And actually, if the crowdfunding model does continue to grow at its current rate, it looks like by the end of next year, I should maybe be able to afford to pay an intern or two, or a contractor for half of the year who's relatively affordable, something at that level. So that's pretty exciting. If we do actually continue apace to that, it means maybe in a year and a half, this is a model that can support not just me, but potentially others too. And this mirrors what the NSF Career grant is meant to do as well. It's something that is supposed to also potentially support at least part of maybe a graduate student's stipend, or possibly stipends for undergraduates who are assisting with research, this kind of thing. But that's a little ways away, the end of next year. And one thing that I've talked about here before is that there's this substantial challenge in switching back and forth between kind of research mind and implementer's mind. I find that even just trying to do the two in the same week is very difficult. So the model that's worked best for me is spending months at a time in one of those mindsets and then switching back and forth between them. And so for kind of 2/3 of 2020, I was in building things mind with Orbit, and then actually for much of this year I've been back in research mind. You've seen a little bit of that output, but kind of more to come from that period, and I'm kind of starting to switch back into implementing mind. But all of this is frustrating. When I've been in research mind for a while, as I have been now, I'll feel like, oh my gosh, there's all these things that I know would make this better and that would let me answer these questions, but I can't, no progress has been made, and months have gone by. And so it feels like the project is kind of staying still. And then when I'm spending a lot of time implementing like I was last year, I'll feel like there are these dozen research questions that I articulated at the start of the year and I've made no progress on them. And I'm like, I'm not actually being a researcher, I'm just like being an engineer. And that feels bad too. Ideally, it would be nice to have some technical help before the end of next year. So to that end, a couple of exciting notes that there have been a few volunteers who've reached out to maybe collaborate with me on Orbit in their nights and weekends, and one of them has actually made his first commit to the repository, so I'm very grateful for Ozzy's help. And then the other exciting news there is that a small group of generous donors have made some one-off gifts to allow me to, this year, have a modest budget to hire a technical contractor. And that's very exciting to maybe have a little bit of professional help. So I've started the process of trying to find the right person for that. Ideally, they are able to be somewhat technically independent and take on moderate-sized infrastructure projects without a ton of oversight, which is a very difficult property to achieve, simultaneous with my very, very modest budget for contractors at this time. So I think the best candidates will be people who are already kind of excited about the research, excited about contributing to open source software, and are perhaps willing to accept more modest compensation in conjunction with those things, and perhaps in conjunction with getting to say, run some of their own ideas about related projects by me and possibly get some mentorship there. We can do like a light barter kind of thing. So anyway, like I said, I've begun conversations with a number of people about that, but I am still on the lookout for a contract hire, and so if what I've just described, that set of impossible conditions, sounds like you or someone you know, please do send them my way. So to wrap things up, I just want to express a lot of gratitude, really. This is a lengthy video about this bizarre funding model for research that I didn't think was possible, and it really is only possible because of you all. It really is a remarkable thing. You're doing something quite unusual here. Time will tell whether this is generalizable or even whether it's sustainable for me personally, but I'm really grateful to be exploring this with you all. So thank you.